The merciless Arizona sun beat down on the dusty main street of Copper Ridge, casting harsh shadows between the weathered wooden buildings. Sarah Mitchell stood with her back pressed against the rough-hewn post, her wrists bound tightly with coarse rope that bit into her skin with each small movement. The crowd that had gathered to witness her punishment had thinned as the afternoon wore on, but their whispers still echoed in her ears like the buzz of angry wasps. "Caught red-handed she was," muttered Mrs. Henderson, the general store owner's wife, her voice carrying despite her attempt at discretion. $3 silver from the church collection box. Bold as brass, that one. Sheriff Coleman stood nearby, his weathered face impassive as he surveyed the scene. The tin star on his vest caught the sunlight, a reminder of the authority that had placed Sarah in this position. "The evidence is clear," he had declared during the hastily convened town meeting that morning. "Found the coins in her possession, and young Timothy saw her near the church after Sunday service." Sarah's throat was parched, her lips cracked from hours in the sun without water. The simple cotton dress she wore, her only good dress, was now stained with dust and sweat. She had stopped trying to explain her innocence hours ago. Who would believe the word of a 20-year-old woman with no family, no property, and no standing in the community over that of the town's respected citizens? The irony wasn't lost on her that she had been working as a seamstress, taking in mending and alterations to earn honest money. The $3 silver they found in her small room had been payment for a week's worth of work on Mrs. Patterson's Sunday dress. But Mrs. Patterson had conveniently forgotten their arrangement when questioned by the sheriff, claiming she had never hired Sarah for any work. As the shadows grew longer, Sarah's legs trembled with exhaustion. She had been standing since dawn, and the rope around her wrists had long since cut off proper circulation to her hands. The few people who remained on the street gave her a wide berth, some crossing to the other side entirely. She understood their reaction. Associating with a thief, even one who hadn't yet been properly tried, could damage one's reputation in a town like Copper Ridge. "Should have sent her packing months ago," grumbled old Pete from the saloon. "Never did trust that girl. Too quiet, too. Different. The words stung, because Sarah knew what he meant. She didn't have the protection of a husband or family. She read books when she could get them, sometimes staying up late by candlelight to lose herself in stories of places far from this harsh, unforgiving landscape. She had opinions about things beyond cooking and child-rearing, though she had learned to keep them to herself. In a town where conformity meant survival, being different was a dangerous luxury. The church bell chimed 4 o'clock, its bronze voice echoing off the buildings. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's face, tried to recall the feeling of safety she had known before illness took both her parents and left her alone in the world. The memory felt as distant as the mountains on the horizon, wavering like a mirage in the heat. Dr. Hayes emerged from his office across the street, medical bag in hand, and paused when he saw her. For a moment, Sarah thought she saw something like compassion in his eyes. He had been the only one to speak up during the town meeting, suggesting that perhaps they should wait for a proper trial before imposing punishment. But his voice had been quickly shouted down by the others, who insisted that the evidence was clear, and justice swift was justice served. The doctor approached slowly, checking over his shoulder to ensure he wasn't being closely watched. "Miss Mitchell," he said quietly, "are you feeling faint? Do you need water?" Before Sarah could respond, Sheriff Coleman's voice cut through the air. "Doc, you best step away from the prisoner. Town voted, and we're seeing this through." Dr. Hayes hesitated, his jaw tightening with obvious frustration. "John, this isn't right. The girl needs water at the very least." "She should have thought about that before she chose to steal from the Lord's house," the sheriff replied, though his tone lacked conviction. As Dr. Hayes reluctantly moved away, Sarah felt the last thread of hope slip from her grasp. Night would come soon, and with it temperatures that could drop 40 degrees. She had seen what exposure could do to a person in this harsh land. If they left her tied here overnight, she might not survive to see a proper trial. The crowd continued to disperse as evening approached, people returning to their homes and their dinners, content that justice was being served. Sarah found herself increasingly alone on the street, with only the sheriff remaining nearby, smoking his pipe and avoiding direct eye contact with her. It was then, as the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, that Sarah noticed the lone figure approaching from the desert. At first, it was just a dark silhouette against the vast landscape, but as it drew closer, she could make out the form of a man on horseback, moving with a steady, purposeful pace toward the town. The sheriff noticed too, straightening and placing his hand instinctively on his gun belt. Visitors to Copper Ridge were rare, and those who approached alone from the desert were often cause for concern. As the rider drew closer, details became clearer. The man sat his horse with natural grace, his long black hair flowing loose in the evening breeze, his dark skin weathered by years under the desert sun. Sarah's heart quickened as she realized what this meant. In a town where tensions between settlers and the local Apache bands ran high, the arrival of a native man alone would not be welcomed. She had heard the stories, the fears whispered behind closed doors about raids and retribution, though she had also heard other stories, quieter ones, about Apache people who had shown kindness to lost travelers, who knew the land better than anyone, and sometimes shared that knowledge with those who showed respect. The man's eyes met hers across the distance, and in that moment, Sarah saw something she had not encountered all day, recognition of her humanity. Not judgment, not condemnation, but simple acknowledgement that she was a person in distress. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah realized that her ordeal was far from over. But for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt a spark of something that might have been hope. The Apache man dismounted his horse with fluid grace, his moccasined feet making no sound as they touched the dusty ground. The sheriff's hand remained on his pistol, but he made no move to draw it, perhaps recognizing that the stranger had approached openly, without the stealth that would suggest hostile intent. "Evening," the Apache man said, his English clear and accent-free, surprising both Sarah and the sheriff. His voice was deep and calm, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. He appeared to be in his 30s, with strong, weathered features and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "State your business," Sheriff Coleman replied, tension evident in his posture. The Apache man's gaze moved deliberately to Sarah, taking in her bound wrists, her exhausted state, the way she swayed slightly on her feet. "I see a woman who needs help." "This doesn't concern you," the sheriff said firmly. "This is town business, legal business." What was her crime? The directness of the question seemed to catch Coleman off guard. "Theft from the church. We have witnesses." The Apache man stepped closer to Sarah, studying her face with intense concentration. "You took money from the church?" he asked her directly. Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper, her throat raw from hours in the dry air. "No, I earned that money honestly. I'm a seamstress." "She's lying," came a voice from the shadows. Mrs. Henderson had returned, probably drawn by curiosity about the stranger. "Timothy saw her near the church, and we found the money in her room." The Apache man turned to face Mrs. Henderson, his expression unreadable. "This Timothy, he is a truthful boy." "Of course he is," Mrs. Henderson replied indignantly. "And the woman who paid her for sewing, she confirmed this payment?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Mrs. Henderson's face reddened, but she said nothing. The sheriff cleared his throat uncomfortably. "That's not. The payment arrangement couldn't be verified," Coleman admitted reluctantly. "So you punish her based on the word of a child and the silence of someone who would benefit from that silence," the Apache man observed. It wasn't a question. The tension in the street was thick enough to cut. Sarah watched this exchange with growing amazement. No one in town had bothered to ask these logical questions, to examine the holes in the case against her. They had been so eager to assign blame, to have their justice served quickly and visibly. "Look here," the sheriff said, his voice rising. "I don't know who you think you are, but you can't just ride into our town and question our decisions. We know our people." "I am called Joseph," the Apache man replied simply, "and I know something of justice as well." He moved closer to Sarah, and she could see the careful way he studied the ropes binding her wrists, the concern in his dark eyes as he noticed the angry red marks where the rope had cut into her skin. Without asking permission from the sheriff, he drew a knife from his belt, a simple, well-made blade that gleamed in the lamplight from the nearby buildings. "What do you think you're doing?" Coleman demanded, his hand moving to his gun. Joseph paused, the knife held low and non-threatening. "I think I am seeing a wrong that needs to be made right." He looked directly at the sheriff. "Will you shoot me for cutting free a woman who has been punished without proper trial? In your white man's law, is this not something you call due process?" The sheriff's face flushed. The question struck at the heart of the matter. They had indeed denied Sarah a proper trial, moving directly to punishment based on circumstantial evidence. In the heat of righteous anger and community pressure, they had skipped the very legal processes they claimed to uphold. "The evidence was clear enough," Coleman said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Clear enough to risk a woman's life?" Joseph gestured to Sarah's deteriorating condition. "She has been here since dawn, without water, without food. In this heat, in these conditions, you are not pursuing justice. You are pursuing execution." Dr. Hayes, who had been watching from his office window, chose that moment to emerge again. "Joseph speaks the truth, John. I've been saying the same thing all day. This isn't right." Mrs. Henderson looked between the doctor, the sheriff, and the Apache man with obvious frustration. "Since when do we take advice from savages about how to run our town?" The word hung in the air like a slap. Joseph's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw something flicker in his eyes. Not anger, but a deep, weary sadness that spoke of a lifetime of such encounters. "Mrs. Henderson," Dr. Hayes said firmly, "that language isn't welcome here." "It's fine, Doctor," Joseph said quietly. "I have heard worse, but words do not change what is right." He turned back to Sarah. "Miss, do you consent to my cutting your bonds?" The formal question, asked with such dignity, despite everything that had just transpired, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Please." Joseph stepped forward and, with careful precision, cut through the ropes binding her wrists. The moment her hands were free, Sarah's legs gave out. She would have fallen if Joseph hadn't caught her gently, supporting her weight as circulation slowly returned to her hands and arms. "You're safe now," he said quietly, his voice carrying a certainty that cut through all the chaos and confusion of the day. The sheriff stood frozen, clearly uncertain how to proceed. Drawing his gun on a man who had just performed an act of mercy would be difficult to justify, especially with Dr. Hayes watching and several other townspeople beginning to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. "This isn't over," Coleman said finally. "She's still under suspicion." "Then investigate properly," Joseph replied. "But she will not be tied to a post like an animal while you do so." He helped Sarah to a sitting position on the wooden sidewalk, then retrieved a water pouch from his horse and offered it to her. The water was warm but tasted better than anything she had ever experienced. As she drank, Joseph spoke quietly to Dr. Hayes. "She needs proper care, food, rest, treatment for the rope burns." "I can provide that," Dr. Hayes said immediately. "My clinic has a room where she can recover safely." Joseph nodded his approval, then turned back to Sarah. "Can you stand?" With his help, she managed to get to her feet, though her legs shook with exhaustion. As they slowly made their way toward the doctor's office, Joseph walked between her and the sheriff, his presence both protective and quietly commanding. "Why?" Sarah asked as they reached the clinic steps. "Why did you help me?" Joseph paused, considering the question seriously. My grandmother taught me that we are all connected. When one person suffers injustice, we all suffer. When one person is helped, we all benefit. He looked at her with eyes that held depths of understanding. And perhaps because I know what it is like to be judged by others' fears rather than your own actions. As Dr. Hayes opened his clinic door and gestured for them to enter, Sarah realized that this moment had changed something fundamental in her understanding of the world. In a day that had shown her the worst of human nature, prejudice, cowardice, the willingness to sacrifice justice for convenience, this Apache man had demonstrated its best: courage, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to what was right. The warmth of the clinic enveloped her as they stepped inside, but it was the warmth of unexpected kindness that truly began to heal her wounded spirit. Dr. Hayes's clinic smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs, a clean, medicinal scent that was somehow comforting after the dust and heat of the street. Sarah sat on the examination table while the doctor carefully cleaned and bandaged the rope burns on her wrists, his gentle hands steady with years of practice. Joseph stood near the window, keeping watch on the street where a small crowd had gathered, their voices carrying through the glass in animated discussion. The sheriff paced back and forth outside, clearly agitated by the turn of events, but uncertain how to proceed. "These wounds will heal cleanly if kept dry and clean," Dr. Hayes said as he finished wrapping Sarah's wrists with soft white bandages. "You'll need to rest for several days. The sun exposure and dehydration were severe." "I don't have anywhere to rest," Sarah admitted quietly. "My room was at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, but after the accusation," she didn't need to finish. "No respectable establishment would house someone accused of theft, regardless of their guilt or innocence." "You can stay here," Dr. Hayes said immediately. "I have a small room in the back that I use for patients who need extended care." Joseph turned from the window. "That is generous, but it may bring trouble for you, Doctor. The town's anger has not cooled." "Then let it come, Doctor." Hayes replied with more steel in his voice than Sarah had heard before. "I took an oath to do no harm and to help those in need. That oath doesn't include exceptions for public opinion." Sarah watched the interaction between the two men with growing fascination. Despite the vast cultural differences between them, the educated Eastern doctor and the Apache warrior, they seemed to understand each other perfectly, united by a shared commitment to justice and compassion. "Joseph," she said tentatively, testing the name he had given. "May I ask you something?" He nodded encouragingly. "How do you speak English so well? I mean," she faltered, realizing how her question might sound. "You mean, how does a savage come to speak the white man's language?" Joseph's tone held no accusation, only mild amusement at her discomfort. "I didn't mean to offend." "You didn't." Joseph pulled a chair closer to the examination table and sat down, making their conversation more intimate and equal. "I learned English from the missionaries when I was young. My father believed that understanding your language would help our people navigate the changing world. Later, I learned that knowledge is a tool. It can be used for survival, for building bridges, or for war." Dr. Hayes finished putting away his medical supplies and joined their conversation. "Joseph often serves as a translator when there are disputes between the Apache bands and the territorial government. He's helped prevent more conflicts than most people realize." "You work with the government?" Sarah asked, surprised. "I work for peace," Joseph corrected. "Sometimes that means working with the government, sometimes it means working against it. Today, it meant working with my conscience." Through the window, they could see that the crowd outside had grown larger. Mrs. Henderson stood at its center, gesticulating wildly as she spoke. Her voice, raised in indignation, occasionally carried through the glass, though the words were indistinct. "They're angry that I interfered," Joseph observed. "Some will call it an act of aggression, evidence that the Apache cannot be trusted." "That's not fair," Sarah protested. "You saved my life." "Fairness and politics rarely occupy the same space," Dr. Hayes said grimly. "Joseph, Perhaps you should consider leaving town before this escalates further." Joseph was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying the crowd outside. "If I leave now, what happens to Miss Mitchell? Does she receive justice, or does she become a convenient scapegoat for the town's frustration?" The question hung heavy in the air. They all knew the answer. Without Joseph's intervention, the town would likely have proceeded with whatever punishment they deemed appropriate, caring little for proper legal procedures. "I have an idea," Sarah said suddenly. Both men turned to her with interest. "What if we prove my innocence? Really prove it? Not just with words, but with evidence they can't dismiss." "How?" Dr. Hayes asked. Sarah took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. "Mrs. Patterson lied about hiring me to alter her dress, but lies leave traces. If I can show the dress itself, prove that I did the work she claims never happened, it might be enough to raise doubt about the rest of the accusations." Joseph leaned forward with interest. "This dress, where would it be now? Probably hanging in her wardrobe. She was very particular about it, insisted on specific alterations for the church social next week." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke, hope beginning to replace despair. "I took in the waist by 3 inches and adjusted the hemline. The needlework is very distinctive. I use a particular stitch pattern that I learned from my mother. Even if we could examine this dress," Dr. Hayes said thoughtfully, "how would we get Mrs. Patterson to admit her deception?" "We don't need her admission," Joseph said slowly. "We need the truth to be visible to others. If the dress shows evidence of recent alterations, if those alterations match Miss Mitchell's description exactly, it becomes much harder to dismiss her story." Sarah felt a surge of excitement. "And there's more. I keep a record book of all my work. Measurements, alterations made, payments received. It's hidden in my room, but if we could retrieve it, that would require getting into Mrs. Patterson's boarding house," Dr. Hayes pointed out. "She's made it clear that Sarah isn't welcome there." "Not Sarah," Joseph said quietly. "Me." Both Sarah and Dr. Hayes stared at him. "That's incredibly dangerous," the doctor protested. "If I'm caught, I'm a thief and a savage confirming their worst fears," Joseph acknowledged. "But if I'm not caught, and we find evidence that clears Miss Mitchell's name, perhaps some good comes from this day." Sarah reached out impulsively and grasped Joseph's hand. "I can't ask you to take that risk for me. You've already done so much." Joseph looked down at their joined hands, then met her eyes directly. "You didn't ask. I'm offering. There is a difference." The simple statement carried weight that went beyond words. In the span of a few hours, this man had shown her more loyalty and support than she had received from people she had lived among for months. The realization was both humbling and profound. "If we're going to do this," Dr. Hayes said, "we need a plan. Mrs. Patterson will be at the church meeting tonight. They're discussing the Indian problem in light of today's events." His tone made clear what he thought of such discussions. "The boarding house should be empty except for old Mr. Cromwell, and he's nearly deaf." Joseph nodded slowly. "I can enter unseen. But I need to know exactly where to look and what to look for." Sarah closed her eyes, visualizing the layout of Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. "My room is on the 2nd floor, 3rd door on the right. The record book is sewn into the lining of my trunk. There's a small slit in the fabric near the bottom left corner. Mrs. Patterson's room is at the end of the hall. Her wardrobe is against the far wall, and the dress would be hanging on the right side, where she keeps her best clothes. The alterations I made," she continued, "they're on the inside seams. I used a double stitch pattern in cream thread that contrasts slightly with the original navy fabric. Anyone who knows sewing would recognize it as recent work." Joseph memorized these details with the focused attention of someone whose life had often depended on precise observation. "And if I find these things, then we present them to the sheriff and demand a proper investigation," Dr. Hayes said. "Force him to confront the evidence, rather than relying on hearsay and prejudice." Outside, the church bell began to chime 7 o'clock, its bronze voice echoing off the surrounding buildings. The crowd in the street started to disperse as people headed toward the church for the emergency meeting Mrs. Henderson had undoubtedly called. "It's time," Joseph said, standing and checking the knife at his belt. "If I'm not back in 2 hours, assume I've been caught and distance yourselves from this plan." "Joseph," Sarah called as he moved toward the door. He turned back to her. "Thank you for everything. Whatever happens next, you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "Hope," she said simply. Joseph's stern expression softened slightly. "Hold on to that hope, Sarah Mitchell. We're going to need it before this night is over." As he slipped out into the gathering darkness, Sarah and Dr. Hayes settled in to wait, both understanding that the next few hours would determine not just Sarah's fate, but the future of their small community's relationship with justice, truth, and the courage required to pursue both. The church meeting had been raucous and heated, with voices raised in anger and fear echoing through the wooden building until well past 9 o'clock. Dr. Hayes and Sarah had listened to the distant sounds of argument and accusation, each knowing that much of the discussion centered on the events of the day and what they meant for the town's future. Joseph returned as silently as he had left, materializing in the clinic doorway like a shadow given form. In his hands, he carried Sarah's leather-bound record book and a carefully folded navy dress that rustled softly as he set it on the examination table. "Mrs. Patterson's wardrobe was exactly as you described," he said quietly, "and this dress tells a very interesting story." Sarah's hands trembled as she unfolded the garment, examining the alterations she had made just 2 weeks earlier. The needlework was unmistakably hers. The precise double stitching, the careful attention to detail that had been her mother's legacy. "This is it," she breathed. "This is the proof." Dr. Hayes examined the dress with the methodical attention he brought to medical diagnoses. "The alterations are clearly recent. The thread hasn't had time to fade or fray, and you can see where the original seam was taken in. This work was done within the last few weeks." Sarah opened her record book to the relevant page, pointing to the entry written in her careful handwriting: "Mrs. Patterson, navy church dress, waist taken in 3 inches, hem shortened 2 inches, $2. 50, payment due on delivery." "The dates match perfectly," she said. "And here's the notation about the specific thread I used, cream on navy, just as you can see in the dress." Joseph nodded grimly. "Then Mrs. Patterson lied when she denied hiring you. The question now is whether the sheriff will acknowledge this evidence or dismiss it to save face." Before anyone could respond, heavy footsteps echoed on the clinic's front porch, followed by a sharp knock. Dr. Hayes opened the door to find Sheriff Coleman standing there, his face haggard with exhaustion and something that might have been regret. "Doctor," Coleman said formally, "I need to speak with Miss Mitchell and the Apache." "Joseph," Dr. Hayes corrected firmly. "His name is Joseph." The sheriff nodded slightly, acknowledging the correction. "Joseph, then, may I come in?" Once inside, Coleman's eyes immediately went to the dress and record book laid out on the examination table. His expression grew increasingly troubled as he took in the evidence before him. "The church meeting didn't go well," he said finally. "Too many people asking too many questions about what happened today, about proper procedures and due process." He looked directly at Joseph. "About whether we acted more out of prejudice than justice." "And what did you conclude?" Joseph asked. Coleman removed his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. "That I may have made a serious mistake, that we all may have." He gestured toward the dress. "Is that what I think it is?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "It's Mrs. Patterson's church dress, the one I altered for her 2 weeks ago. The work she claimed never happened." The sheriff examined the evidence with the thorough attention it deserved, his expression growing darker with each detail he observed. "The stitching is recent," he admitted, "and it matches your description exactly." He opened the record book and read the entry, comparing it to the physical evidence before him. "There's more," Dr. Hayes said quietly. Mrs. Patterson wasn't the only one who lied tonight. Coleman looked up sharply. What do you mean? Young Timothy, Dr. Hayes continued. His mother brought him to see me this evening worried about a fever. While I was examining him, he started crying and confessed that he never actually saw Sarah near the church. Mrs. Henderson told him to say he did, promised him a penny candy if he supported her story. The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. The case against Sarah, already built on circumstantial evidence and convenient omissions, crumbled completely in the face of documented proof and confessed perjury. Sheriff Coleman sank into a chair, his shoulders slumping with the weight of his mistakes. "Sweet Lord," he murmured, "what have we done?" "You nearly killed an innocent woman," Joseph said bluntly, though his tone held no anger, only sad certainty. "And you used the fear of my people to justify abandoning your own principles of justice." "I know," Coleman replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know, and I'll have to live with that. But the question now is how we make this right." Sarah looked between the three men, each grappling with the implications of the evening's discoveries. "The truth is out now," she said. "That's what matters. I don't need revenge. I just need my name cleared and my life back." Dr. Hayes nodded approvingly. "Sarah's right. The focus should be on justice going forward, not punishment for past mistakes." Joseph was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying the sheriff's face. "Sheriff Coleman," he said finally, "will you call a town meeting tomorrow? Will you present this evidence publicly and clear Miss Mitchell's name?" "Yes," Coleman replied without hesitation. "Yes, I will. And I'll make sure Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Patterson face consequences for their lies. Perjury and false witness, those are serious crimes. And will you acknowledge publicly that an Apache man helped uncover the truth?" Joseph pressed. "Will you tell them that justice was served not because of fear and prejudice, but in spite of them?" Coleman met his gaze directly. "I will, though I suspect it won't make me popular with everyone in town." "Popularity and justice are rarely the same thing," Joseph observed. "But a sheriff who chooses justice over popularity is a sheriff worth respecting." As the evening wound toward its close, the four of them worked together to prepare for the next day's revelations. Dr. Hayes would present Timothy's confession and his medical opinion about Sarah's condition after her ordeal. Sheriff Coleman would display the dress and record book as evidence of Mrs. Patterson's deception, and Joseph would stand before the town that had viewed him with suspicion and fear, demonstrating through his actions that justice and compassion were not limited by race or culture. "There's something I need to say," Sarah announced as they prepared to part ways for the night. The three men turned to her with attention. "Joseph, when you cut me free today, you said I was safe. But you did more than that. You reminded me that there are still good people in the world, people who will stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." She looked at Dr. Hayes. "Doctor, you risked your reputation to help a stranger. That takes a special kind of courage." Finally, she turned to Sheriff Coleman. "And Sheriff, it takes even more courage to admit when you're wrong and work to make it right. Thank you for that." Coleman's weathered face flushed with emotion. "Miss Mitchell, I hope someday you can forgive what I put you through." "I already have," Sarah replied simply. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about choosing not to let it poison your heart. I won't let Mrs. Henderson's lies or Mrs. Patterson's greed turn me bitter." Joseph smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from him. "Your mother raised you well," he said. "She would be proud of the woman you've become." As Joseph prepared to leave, Sarah caught his arm gently. "Will I see you again? After tomorrow, I mean?" He considered the question seriously. "My people have a saying, 'Paths that cross in kindness will cross again in peace.' I believe we will meet again, Sarah Mitchell, and when we do, I hope it will be under happier circumstances." With that, he disappeared into the night as quietly as he had come, leaving Sarah with Dr. Hayes and Sheriff Coleman to plan for a dawn that would bring vindication, justice, and perhaps most importantly, proof that even in the hardest of places and times, compassion could triumph over fear. The next morning, As the church bell called the people of Copper Ridge to another emergency meeting, Sarah stood straight and proud, her bandaged wrists a visible reminder of injustice overcome. She thought of Joseph's words, "You're safe now," and realized they had been prophetic in ways she was only beginning to understand. She was safe not just from immediate harm, but safe in the knowledge that there were people willing to fight for truth, willing to bridge divides of culture and suspicion in service of what was right. In a world that often seemed determined to tear itself apart along lines of difference and fear, that knowledge was a treasure worth more than any amount of stolen silver. As Sheriff Coleman called the meeting to order and began to present the evidence that would clear her name, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope for the future. Not just her own future, but the future of a community learning, painfully but necessarily, that justice delayed was not justice served, and that the measure of a society lay not in its prejudices, but in its willingness to overcome them. The truth, as her mother used to say, had a way of surfacing, like gold in a prospector's pan, heavy and valuable and impossible to ignore once revealed. Today, that truth would shine bright enough to light the way forward for all of them.